Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you to session 2 of our SoCast Lounge webinar series. We just finished up session 1 on search engine marketing, and session 2 is I'm thrilled to welcome my friends here, Matt Kundle and John Gay, who are going to be walking us through. So you want to get into podcasting? I would say in my 10 months at SoCast, the two biggest questions I get from broadcasters, one is about search engine marketing. The second one is about the whole podcasting space. And I thought, I'm still learning about this space as well, but I've got a few people in my network that can really be helpful, and they're joining us here today. So first of all, I want to introduce Matt Kundle from the Sound Off podcast. I've known Matt for a number of years. He's been in the radio business for a number of years. He started off in Nova Scotia. He worked at Show FM in Montreal and at the Bear in Edmonton, and I got to know him when he was our program director at Chorus in Winnipeg. So he's been really helpful in teaching and educating me in the podcast space. So Matt, thanks for dedicating some time and joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me. Love being here.
And next up, we've got our special guest, John Gay from JAG in Detroit. So I love talking to a Syracuse grad.
Yes, go Orange.
Go Orange. I have fond memories of going to the Carrier Dome, watching college basketball. John has been in the radio, was in the radio industry for a number of years. He started off in Vermont, went to Detroit, has been in New Orleans, and then I think in 2018 got out of the radio space and got into the podcast space. And although they're kind of competing, kind of networks, they're collaborating on a lot of stuff. And I'm finding, Matt, that in the podcast space, there's a ton of collaboration that goes on. So if I wanted to start my podcast, let's say I wanted to start a podcast about the Bruins Habs rivalry, because you're hailing from Montreal and John is hailing from Boston.
Yes.
If I wanted to start a podcast, what is it the first thing I need to think about before starting a podcast?
You have to think about your biggest episode, which would be to invite Matt and John on to talk about the playoffs back in, I think it was about 2002, when the Bruins beat the Habs, and it was a very difficult exit for John to leave the what was then known as the Bell Center.
Yes, that was 2004 when I made the mistake of bringing a 3x5 foot American flag to the Bell Center in Montreal. It was not well received.
You actually brought a flag into the Bell Center?
Yeah, it was a long story. The Canadians fans had booed the Star Spangled Banner prior to Game 3, so we went up for Game 4. I said, I'm not going to stand for this. I'm going to wave my colors. The Bruins won in double overtime. We tucked the flag into our coats and got out of there real quick.
That is hysterical. So I want to remind our attendees before we get started, Matt, if you do have a question for Matt or for John, pop them into the chat. This is going to be an interesting webinar for me, because although it's my webinar, I doubt these two are going to give me a chance to speak. So I'm going to shut up. And Matt, John, I'll let you guys get rolling.
Hey, thanks a lot, and thanks for having us here today. I didn't meet John until about 2019, and after he had left radio, I had been out of radio as well. The closest we came, though, was I used to catch John's show when he was on 95 XXX down in Vermont, and I was up in Chaume, and that station could reach into Montreal. So I did have a chance to listen to him back then. But since then, we both found our way into podcast, and being two former radio program directors and performers and people who had dedicated their life to radio, we found an afterlife in radio in podcasting. And since we left that behind, we've discovered a lot of things, and we're really here today to share that with you and let you know just how it's different and how it's similar at the same time. And some of this stuff is quite eye-opening. And John and I are really going to walk you through what we've learned over the last few years.
And you want to hear this one, Matt, or you want me to take this one?
Go ahead.
So we both have a podcast. In addition to producing podcasts for others, it seems kind of silly to do a podcast for the people without doing our own. We have very different sounding podcasts. Mine is a 3-minute weekly podcast that covers the podcasting industry and tips to help you make your podcast sound better. It's weekly. Matt, the long-winded line, actually, Matt put in himself. I did not call him long-winded. That's a little self-deprecating humor on his side. And he interviews radio folks. It's the podcast about broadcast. It's a great show if you haven't heard the Sound Off podcast. And combined in the 6 years together that we've been in radio and have moved over to podcasting, as Matt said, a lot of similarities, a lot of differences. A great analogy that I've heard is it's almost two cars traveling down the highway, each in their own lane. And then sometimes you can go between the lanes, and then sometimes you just stay in your own lane. It's kind of the analogy that I heard. So this is sort of to give you an overview as to what you're going to want to think about as you get into the podcasting space.
And I think if you sort of look at both the podcasts that we do, John has experimented with shorter podcasts. He's actually cut it down to about 3 minutes, so it fits a few more platforms as well. But there's a lot that you can learn. You can also do a short podcast, but you can also do long podcasts. There are no time restrictions. One of the questions that inevitably comes up when we do this is, how long should a podcast be? And I'll steal from James Cridland, who's the radio futurologist, and suggest that as long as it needs to be, never longer.
I always say as long as it's good. So no need to stretch to hit some artificial 28 minutes and 30 seconds or whatever it is. When you're done, you're done.
So Matt, you had touched on when we were prepping for this, you'd said that like podcasting is really different than radio. So like walk me through your thoughts on what you meant by that.
So when I started my podcast in 2016, I was really looking for the intersection between radio and what I thought was going to be, the future for radio and how it was going to intersect and how radio could determine some best practices. And as I got to this, it's actually within the last year, I've really determined that radio doesn't have as much in common with podcasting as we would believe. Visually, there's a microphone, there's headphones, there's recording and interviews, and many of the things that we do see. But when podcasting really has more in common with blogs, magazines, and even books. And you can put it down, you can pick it up. It's the on-demand nature of it. It's evergreen content. Having come from radio where it's about quarter hours and time and weather together, and we're going to do the sports and current. Radio is so strong and so vital because it's current, it is now, it is local. And podcasting really hasn't cornered the market on local, and you can do a local podcast, but radio is really the one that is very strong on that. Podcasting is also a headphone experience. So when you're speaking, you're really speaking to a lot of people who are using their earbuds, headphones. It's a little bit quieter. I know a lot of people don't like this in radio when I say radio really does talk at you and podcasting talks to you. But podcasting really has sort of cornered the market on that one-on-one conversation that a lot of program directors I know, and I being one of them, has sort of always encouraged talent to do. And I think it's very important to stress, and I might have even mentioned it twice, and I'll mention it a few times today, people will not stop listening to your radio station because they start listening to podcasting. They are different. They will be treated differently. Radio is more a lot of appointment tuning. We want to listen now, and podcasting is more about, on demand. They'll listen when they can.
Let me just jump in here for a second, Matt. The one thing that I think radio and podcasting share is that intimate audio connection. If you think about your favorite morning show host that you grew up listening to, you feel like you know the people because they were sharing their lives with you on the radio. And, it's a very intimate relationship having them with you either in your headphones or in the car on the way to school and the way to work. Podcasting affords that to anybody doing a podcast. If you do a podcast well, and you create compelling content, you're going to create that same bond with your listener that your traditional talk show host or morning show host would.
Now, I think, Matt, we touched on this a couple of weeks ago, and I think you might touch on this a little bit later, but why is it that some broadcasters want to take their morning show and just clip it up and turn it into a podcast? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I got a slide for that up ahead if you want, or I could answer it now.
Should we put a pin in that? Use a corporate term, put a pin in that.
We'll put a pin in that, and let's start with the basics of what's a podcast for everyone.
Well, a podcast is just a portable piece of audio, as you can see here. Sometimes I think of it as what DVR did for television. It's what we've done for radio in that sense. If you're repurposing a podcast, you can have that content on demand. But beyond the radio content, beyond the time, temperature, weather, and things like that, this is audio that goes with you wherever you go. You don't need to be near a radio. You don't need to, I listen to podcasts when I'm in the car. I listen to podcasts when I'm walking my dog every morning. It goes with you on any internet connected device. And of course, the term podcast came from when they were on iPods in the very early days, and you connect it with the USB cable and all that. We've come a long way since then.
And there are like, I know when we were chatting the other day, John, we were saying that there's there's a ton of podcasts that are out. I know iHeart just made there was a press release at Inside Radio about the size of their ecosystem in terms.
Oh, we have a slide for that too.
It's almost like we got this scripted, brother.
But this is a really good point that you make about there being too many podcasts. There's a difference in how many podcasts are out there. Don't be scared by that 2.3 million number. Not that many are active. Matt can explain this a little bit more as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things the pandemic afforded is that even though a lot of people had started a podcast, they didn't really continue with it. So when you do the math on the whole thing, it's really not as many active podcasts out there. And I'll mention him a few times, but Rob Walsh over at Libsyn runs the numbers quite often, and Daniel Lewis does as well. He's got, this, by the way, is a figure taken from his website, My Podcast Reviews, where he's actually counting all the podcasts that are out there. And so when you hear numbers like 2.3, 2.4 million podcasts, people get discouraged. They're like, well, I'm not going to do a podcast because there's too many of them. Well, in truth, there are really only about 322,000 podcasts that are active that have uploaded episodes in the last 90 days. And that's podcasts that have 10 or more episodes. So you know that people are consistent in doing them. And I've always found it a little bit weird that, well, I'm not going to do a podcast because there's so many. Nobody would ever say, I'm not going to write a song because too many songs have been recorded. I'm not going to write a book because there's too many books that are available. But for whatever reason, people get a little bit tepid when it comes to recording.
And the number of podcasts pales in comparison to the number of blogs as well. People still write blogs, but this is really, almost 14%, I think, is what the numbers come out to as far as how many of these are actually active and how many people are creating content and have committed to at least 10 episodes. And beyond that, we can get a little bit later on if you guys want as the audience, but if you have a specific niche, if you have a specific area that you're focused in, you have way less competition. You might have a podcast about basket weaving, and maybe you're not going to have 1 million people listen to a podcast about basket weaving, but there's probably a basket company that would love to get in front of people who are dedicated enough to listen to a podcast about basket weaving.
Yeah.
I stole this slide from Joel Saul-Sehy of the Stacking Benjamins podcast at the Podcast Movement Convention a couple of years ago. If you think about any James Bond movie, how does a James Bond movie start? It starts with a car crash. It starts with a helicopter and a car going into a lake. It starts with a chase scene. It grabs your attention right out of the gate. You want to think about that in your podcast. You want to, as Joel says, decrease friction with your audience. I know everybody on this call who has heard a podcast that started with, oh yeah, so great weather we're having today, and went to this great new diner down the street. The eggs Benedict were fantastic. And your audience doesn't care. Your audience, especially the way Apple displays podcasts now, is going to probably get a first impression by checking out the first 2 minutes of your latest episode. In that first 2 minutes, you've got to grab their attention. You don't have to do the old SNL sketch of there's something in your house killing you right now. We'll tell you what it is next. You don't have to do that. But you've got to give me a reason to keep listening. Tell me what you're going to cover in that podcast. Tell me what's coming up, who you're going to speak to, the important stuff that you're going to talk about, because that's going to get me to stick around. It's like a tease in radio. Think about, give me a reason to keep listening, essentially, is the key to this whole thing, instead of just endless banter. Because I'll tell you, aside from bad audio, pointless banter at the beginning would be the number 2 tune-out factor for podcast listeners.
So in terms of planning the show, Matt, I know you guys added a slide in here about kind of show prep and the first 2 minutes. Just walk everyone through, now that you've decided you want to do a show, how do you plan for it and what should be included in there?
So a lot of people will come to us and say, I want to start a show. And then John and I will put them through a battery of questions. Mm-hmm. The questions that I like to ask are, what are your first 3 episodes? What do they sound like? And can you write an amazing trailer for that? So like when we think of, again, I'll go back to James Bond or any big, sort of big movie, can you write a 1 or a 2 minute trailer to get people excited about those first 3 episodes? And those first 3 episodes, what do they have in common? And what will the next collection of episodes look like? So, and of course, I know there's a lot of people who might even schedule music here. Well, you might schedule 3 songs in a row. That's a quarter hour. What do those songs sort of form the shape of a radio station? Well, it's kind of the same thing with your podcast stream in a sense. When you also plan the end of the show. And I know that sounds strange, but write out the divorce and the end before you get married and do the start, especially if you've got a partner.
The
So
prenup.
yeah, get a prenup for the show if you do have a partner, because breakups do happen. Who owns the show? Who gets to take what? Some of these things do wind up in court. Also, set a scheduled release. Consistency is so important when you do a podcast, and make it, you're going to make a deal with your audience. We're going to release an episode every 2 weeks, every week, once a month, whatever it is, and then do it at the same time and be consistent. It's worth 20% of the marks when you do it, and let people know that it's going to be coming out at a particular time, and they'll join you. It's not as, there's a reason why your morning show does very well. It's because your morning talent shows up at 5:30 a.m. every day, and people can regulate their media habits to that. There's a reason why The Love Boat did so well, because it was 8 o'clock on ABC Saturday nights, and 9 o'clock was Fantasy Island. And people remembered and made their media time according to that. You're really asking for a piece of the media pie, so start to build that, not only with your listener, but also with yourself, because these things do take work. And then you have to figure out, some of the things that go into making a nice podcast. Obviously, production, artwork, which is now a part of the metadata that goes out. So you want to have nice artwork that appears in Apple and Spotify and all the places you're going to put it. You want to edit it well. And of course, who's going to be able to want to post the podcast up so people can receive it? These are the things that sort of come to mind when we plan out a podcast.
I know Matt's got some weather up there, so hopefully we don't lose him. He's getting a little bit pixelated there, but I think we're good case so far. Matt mentioned that he heard me when I was on 95 XXX in Burlington, Vermont, and my program director there, Ben Hamilton, an early mentor of mine, talked about a radio show as a NASCAR race. You do all your work in the pit so that when the show starts, all you got to do is drive the car. Same is true for a podcast. And as those of you in radio know, the more prep you put in, the better the show is going to sound. Same thing with the podcast.
Got it. So now you've decided you want to do a show. You've planned out the show. You've got your first 3 episodes ready. You've made a commitment to I'm gonna do these every Tuesday. Now you need to distribute it, right?
Yeah, you want to hit the next slide there, Victor? Yeah.
See the way I teed that up for you, Matt? I just teed that up right there.
Go ahead, John.
So a podcast, just like your website, has to be hosted somewhere. It has to live somewhere. And we're not going to get too deep into the technical side of it here, but the gist of it is you have a podcast host, whether that's Libsyn or Simplecast or any of these other types of Buzzsprout, Blueberry. There are many different companies that offer these as a service. And by the way, the free ones, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, stay away from those. You get what you pay for. Free is never free. We could do a whole webinar based on some of the issues with some of the free services. A lot of these services are going to cost you anywhere from $5 to $20 a month. It's very small money. Once you connect your RSS feed, or once you create your podcast, your host will give you an RSS feed. It's a line of code. It's HTTP, blah, 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 blah. Once you have that code, you give that code to Apple, Spotify, Google, and the other podcast apps, and they will continuously, at regular intervals, check that feed for new content. Once you have a host and you connect it to all these apps once, all you've got to do is upload your latest show to your host, and all these apps will pull it in from that feed. You set it up once, and then you only have one place to put your show, and then it goes spider webs out everywhere, as you can see here. Matt, if anything you want to add to that.
Nope, I know some people will take issue with what I say about Anchor and SoundCloud, but I've been on SoundCloud, and it's not a podcast host. It is something. No. Anchor is free, and I don't think, if you're serious about podcasting, I think anybody who's here today is really seriously considering getting into it. Anchor has the stats are not what you want, and we're going to get into stats in a sec.
I can tell you, when I was on the air here in Detroit, when Edwin did an appearance anywhere, and every teenager came up to me and told me they were the next Eminem, it was check out my stuff on SoundCloud. It's not a podcasting host.
Yeah, that's more for music. We ran into that in New York as well, John, and I would agree with you on that. So Matt, how long should your podcast be? Is there like a magic number in terms of length?
Well, if you ask, some people sort of dumbed it down to like 28 minutes or 22 minutes, whatever your commute was. That's silly. It really needs to be as long as it needs to be. And I think John's proven that. He gets a lot of information in 5 minutes, and you can binge listen like 6 episodes in a half hour if you want with him. But some shows are 15, some are 30, and some are 60. Dan Carlin does Hardcore History. Those are 6 hours long. And I think this is where, podcasting really has a lot in common with books. And that's, if you don't finish it, you'll put it down, you can come back and pick it up later. And it's really as simple as that. Now, that doesn't mean you can go for long hours in recording. I think editing is really important. I'm editing all the time, taking out the ums and the ahs and the useless parts, the things that will drive people away, take out entire, sections and questions that I don't think people will want to listen to. The goal, I know radio's goal is to fill quarter hours and stuff them as much as possible. It's not terribly different in podcasting, but we want to get people to the end of the show. And if you're goofing around in the middle talking about eggs Benedict breakfasts at whatever the place John was mentioning earlier, you're probably not going to get there. I think your goal is really completion rates and what would be the equivalent of time spent listening. I've got a little bit of data that I'm going to share about that a little bit later.
And John, talk to me about branded content. I know you guys got a slide here on Trader Joe's, which is the one example I always heard, even from my time in the US. I know it took like many moons to actually bring that to fruition, but that seems to be another growth opportunity, not just for content, but also from a sales application.
Yeah, it really does close the marketing loop, Victor, in terms of completing the circle. So we'll come back to I'll explain this Trader Joe's thing in a second, but if you have a podcast, it's a way to connect with your real hardcore fans, whether that's radio station listeners or customers of a particular store or brand or service. I work in the financial space, a lot of financial advisors who do branded podcasts. They give financial advice. And at the end of the podcast, hey, if you enjoyed this content and need some help with your planning your retirement, here's how to contact me. So in the podcast, at the end of the podcast, you can say, here's my website, my email, my phone number, my social media. But on your social media and on an newsletter, e-blast, you can then use a link to share your podcast and complete that whole marketing circle. We always say nobody can tell your brand story better than you can, but then we can help folks like Matt and I and the folks that we work with. Trader Joe's, if anybody is familiar with Trader Joe's, it has some really hardcore fans. I think Matt had a contact in the U.S. sent him some contraband up to Canada for some Trader Joe's merchandise. People love Trader Joe's, and they took questions on this podcast of, hey, when is the pumpkin spice stuff coming out, or how come you discontinued this product or that product, and really found a way to connect with their audience, giving voice to that audience, and then maybe taking behind the scenes of, here are some of the decisions we make as far as when we take a product off the shelf, when we put it on the shelf, showing you the man behind the curtain, Wizard of Oz style.
Yeah. And how long did it take to materialize, John? Like the story I heard was it took 18 months for it to actually get off the ground, and now it's been running for quite some time and looks like it's part of their regular marketing.
Matt, do you have any insight on that? I know it's been quite a while that it came together and then came out.
Yeah, there was a lot of discussions about how to put it together, and they've marketed it really well. But it's inside, like how the sausage is made, and like why do you sell just one banana? And they wanted it to sort of have the same texture and quirkiness that Trader Joe's has when you go to shop there. There's a lot of branded podcasts, and I think there's, being from radio, we run the risk of overselling and hyping, and let's give the phone number again. You look at some of the more successful branded podcasts. Choiceology is one that I think is, I want to say Charles Schwab, but they don't mention Charles Schwab. They're really offering up, advice and content and suggestions, and subtly mentioning, where it's from. It's sort of a form of stealth marketing. And I thought the example John, presented about, financial advisors giving advice. By the way, here's my number if you need me. But it's really, again, it's about the content and building your audience and trust.
I will say I think of it a lot of ways as a business transaction. A lot of times you'll hear a podcast, whether it's a branded podcast or not, somebody will start off the podcast by saying, "Oh, subscribe to my newsletter, and here's my social media. Follow me on Twitter, etc., etc., etc." As a listener, you're asking me to do something before you've given me anything of value. If that's why I always tell my clients to save their plugs for, if any, for the end, because give me some really good, compelling content. Okay, now you've given me something of value. Once you've given me something of value, then it's a transaction where you can ask me for something in return and say, okay, if you enjoyed this content and want more, here's how to find me. Because if I'm checking out your show and I don't know you from Adam, and your show starts off with follow me on Twitter, I follow 5,000 people on Twitter. Why am I going to follow you on Twitter? And so I think you have to give to get in that regard.
I think the interesting thing on the branded podcast portion, John, is that like this really gives you a chance to super serve your P1, right?
Yes.
Or your key consumer. And it's like, I heard this saying years ago that still resonates, that if you narrow the focus, you broaden the appeal. And if you're speaking to a smaller group of highly interested people, it's like that message is going to go very, very deep and resonate with them if you're saying the right things.
Absolutely.
So I know, Matt, I asked you the question earlier about morning shows, and you said you had a slide, and I think I'm at that slide now. So talk to me about repurposing the morning show, because that seems like a rather easy thing to do, right?
Yeah, it was something that I did back in 2007 with the morning show that I was programming. I thought, oh, what's this podcast thing? I think we can put the show up there. And we left the show up there on demand, and it was, worked reasonably well. But we have to take the music out, and we should be taking out, obviously, the traffic and the surveillance, because that's not stuff that necessarily works. But if you have a morning show that's producing enough content, here's an opportunity to take that content and put it on demand and put it everywhere where people can find it. And I put up a few of the examples here of shows that air on radio that I will listen to at a later date. Under the Influence with Terry O'Reilly runs, I think, on some NPR stations in the States and the CBC here in Canada, but it's one that is released, the seasons are put out and the episodes on a weekly basis. Colin Cowherd does The Herd. I listen to that every night, and that's the way I consume it. I don't necessarily have the time during the day to listen to it, but if you think about the content that's in there, most of the sports talk in that is still relevant up to 24 hours later. So you have to sort of look at this as milk. When will the milk in the fridge go bad? And that's really
that.
Yeah, it's the way you look at the content that you put out. So, when I look at Terry's show never goes bad, because I can go back and listen to season 1, and his show, by the way, is about marketing. And marketing really doesn't change all that much with the stories that he tells. And I have the example of Mojo in the Morning from Detroit. They put up some of their bits. They're short, but they're there to be consumed. And as well, you can binge and listen to that if you want. Some of them are 8 minutes, some of them are 16 minutes. But it's a way to repurpose some of the great content that you've done.
And I would say use your best content. Don't just say, okay, well, we've got 4 hours or 3 hours of content that ran between 6 and 10 a.m. Let's just slap it up there. Give people, leave them wanting more, as the old radio cliche goes. Just use your best stuff. Don't slap just everything there because it was on the air.
Yeah, and one more thing. I don't think that if you're a morning show and you talk a lot about Hollywood news, that news doesn't last. It changes by like the afternoon. Don't put that up. It's not going to work.
Agreed. Yeah. Just like news and traffic.
So last week when we were chatting, Matt, we were talking about ratings, and look, having done radio for 28 years, it's I get the PPM and average quarter hour or average quarter hour in the States, average minute audience in Canada. So the ratings world in podcasting is quite different, and defining success and understanding ratings really is important. So why don't you guys walk us through kind of like what defines success and how they actually translate ratings?
Okay, well, it starts with the download, and we count downloads. One of the things that as a programmer I got to do is I could look at ratings and sort of determine audience behavior and change, the sound of a radio station to shape what I wanted in an audience. You can do the same stuff with podcasting. So with downloads, we get a couple of pieces of information. Where was the download? Where did the download occur? What are they listening to it on, whether it's a computer or whether it's a mobile device, and what app did you use? And then again, what constitutes a download? So I've mentioned, I mean, for those who've read through here, I've mentioned IAB, and I'm sorry I didn't qualify, that the IAB is the Interactive Advertising Bureau. And back in 2017, they came up with a set of standards, and they've since gone to the 2.0 version of those standards about, well, what constitutes a download? And so that's why if you're on SoundCloud, you know, a Russian bot that comes in to just sort of pass by your show and maybe somebody clicks play and it lasts a second, that would count as a play. That's not really the kind of metric that, you know, podcast advertisers want. So they have come up with a set of standards and filters that allow proper counting of downloads. And it's really a good way to filter out the bots. So generally it's like 60, you want to listen to at least 60 seconds. You can only listen to it once in 24 hours, a bunch of filters there, but you're going to get a good download number in the end. And so a lot of people will ask you, hey, how's your podcast doing? Well, I've got X amount of downloads. By the way, at the bottom, I did mention about consumption stats, and I've got a slide for that a little bit later.
Yeah, I just was going to say that, like the part that I'm always fascinated in the whole digital ecosystem is that the best part about it is that it's highly transparent. The worst part about it is that it's highly transparent because there's nowhere to hide from an advertising standpoint, right? Like if something is not working, you're exposed, and understanding the data is critical. So like as a podcaster, like in the radio world, you're focused on, you know, average quarter hours or average minute audience. Like what is it you're focused in on? Do you want to know just number of downloads? Do you want to know how long they're listening? Do you want to know what types of devices they're looking at? Like what are the things that are important to you two as kind of curators of your own podcasts?
Well, certainly all of the above, Victor, but I think also, you know, consumption, as Matt mentioned at the bottom, we'll get into this a little bit later as well, but you know, if there's a significant dip at 32 minutes of your podcast, did you put an ad there? Did you go on some random tangent that, you know, I keep coming back to the analogy of the breakfast place down the road. Maybe that gives you some feedback as far as what content isn't as strong, or were your ads too long, or were your ads not compelling? Did people skip over content, hit that little +15 or +30 button on their iPhone or their Android? That's really important to know. And unlike a lot of the radio advertising, it's not based on sample. It's you have the numbers for everybody. It's not let's take 1,000 people and extrapolate that out to 2 million.
Yeah, it's like true numbers, right? Yeah. Like it's not so Matt, talk to me about marketing your podcast. So now you know you want what content you're going to run, you know where it's going to be, where you're going to host it, but now you got to let people know about it. The same way you got to market your radio station, you got to market your podcast.
Yeah, this is the part that's when I tell people, I sort of break hearts by saying you should be spending about half your time marketing your show. And it's, you know, you got to tell people about it. And listen, for those who have radio stations and you have some inventory to tell people about the podcast or newsletters or socials, absolutely do it. Radio is in such a good position for telling people about podcasts and getting the word out there. We always want to market, you know, your listeners and get them to go back to your website. And I think a station website is important, but wherever you put the podcast, make sure that you do have a website for it. Don't rely on Apple and Google and Spotify to just, oh, well, I'll just send people there to listen to the show. You should have it up on your station website or on your podcast website, as the case may be. And when you have it, make sure it's in a blog format so that each episode gets its own page, and that you want to keep the Google SEO bots happy. So make sure it's optimized for search engine, for great search engine results. That way, when somebody types in Terry O'Reilly podcast, I get a lot of traffic for that for my podcast because I had Terry on my show. There's Tom Likas. I had him on my show. A lot of people, you know, go looking for Tom and will find my podcast. Bob and Sherry is another one that I get a lot of traffic just coming just because of that Google traffic. So make sure that your website is in order. And I put the 3 badges at the bottom there. You want to use Apple, Google, and Spotify badges if you can. That way, if you show up with a mobile device, if you have an iPhone, you're covered, and if you have an Android, you're covered as well. Some people like Spotify. That's fine too.
I think that's really important too, because if you put all your eggs in the Apple basket or the Spotify basket, now everybody has Spotify. If you say, listen on Apple Podcasts, here's the link for Apple. Number one, Apple could go down. Number two, if you have an Android, you can't listen on Apple Podcasts, so you're excluding people. So you drive the traffic to the website you want them, and then from the website, they can select their app of choice. I think that's really important.
Well, Well, walk me through this slide, Matt. I know you shared it from Lipson. So tell me what like in terms of how my podcast is doing. What is this info telling us?
Well, this one comes from a podcast called The Feed, which Lipson puts out every 2 weeks with Rob and Elsie. This is where, one of the podcasts I listen to get a lot of information. And basically this sort of, well, how is my podcast performing? And one of the things Rob is really good at over at Lipson is he sort of quells people's fears about, am I doing well or not? And that, if I have more than 128 downloads, I've beaten half the podcasts out there. And I think a lot of people need to know that, like 128, you've surpassed half the podcasts out there, provided that it's after 30 days and you get 128 or more downloads. And a lot of people are also like, well, that's not very much. I don't know. If I gave you the opportunity to talk to 128 people every week or every month or whenever you release your show, you'd probably take that opportunity. So you're doing better than you think.
I always tell clients that I would rather have 100 podcast listeners than 500 Facebook likes or Instagram followers, because it doesn't take much to click that little heart on a cat video. But every one of those people who is listening to your podcast, you have their attention for the time period they're listening to your podcast. So that's really valuable ears to have on your show.
Well, this is I think you touched on this earlier, John. You were talking about when you're looking at your podcast and where you see the peaks and valleys, understanding what you did in terms of, I guess this is almost like your sound check post show, right? Like, so just walk me through this stuff.
Well, Apple and Spotify are the two biggest platforms, so they will show you as far as if your listeners listened on that specific platform, where they came, where they left, and if people are fast forwarding and skipping over stuff. If you're listening to 80% of your show, that's a good number. And Matt, this is Matt's slide, so I'll let him jump into some of the technical stuff here.
Yeah, so it starts at the beginning. There's a dip because people know the intro to the show, and the intro is boring. They already know what the show is. They've already come in. That doesn't mean don't do an intro, because if somebody were to put a podcast player up on a website, you do want to have a little bit of branding up there, but keep your intro short. It doesn't need to be longer than 10 or 15 seconds.
Right.
So because people will fast forward it if they're subscribed to you. As the show kicks along, you can see there's a little bit of dip on the first ad and some on the second ad. That's inevitable. Some people will fast forward through an ad. It's as simple as a double touch on the ear if you've got some of those fancy ear pods, or fast forwarding the 15. And and then one of the things I really see, and this is in all the episodes, is that when you start to hint that the show is over by saying, well, this is great, we're going to wrap it up, or I've just got one question, those are trigger points to, I'm going to move on. Like, you're actually telling people to go find another podcast to listen to. So you want to keep all that sort of verbiage out of there and avoid that little dip at the end. And I said, what the hell? So that's 101%. And this really speaks to the value of Sherry Lynch. And she's one half of the Bob and Sherry show, and I had her on, and this was the first time I think I got 101% consumption. So nice. Somebody listened twice, as it were. A good number's over 80%, by the way.
You touched on ratings and charts, and you've got a slide here on being skeptical of the Apple chart. So walk me through that, because I would think that the average person would think that these numbers are 100% accurate.
They are completely accurate. However, it's Apple only. So if you have a lot of people who are using Apple phones to listen and using the Apple app, yeah, you're going to have an advantage over somebody else. If you released it on a particular day of the week that works, maybe you're in a different category. So for instance, if you have a podcast about swimming, congratulations, you're number 15 on the chart, because there's only 14 other podcasts about swimming. So, you got, it's what you're up against and the categories that you're up against. And it's a comparative, and, comparison being the thief of joy. And by the way, just to prove my point, here I am number 1 in Nigeria in the performing arts category. But when you really break it down, the penetration of Apple product in Nigeria is very low. And obviously people who work at radio stations in Nigeria must enjoy their Apple product, because they vaulted me to number 1 ahead of some pretty popular podcasts. So it doesn't mean that it's wrong. be leery that it doesn't mean that you're necessarily a success. Your main number I think you need to pay attention to is really tied to your downloads.
I think it's a very common thing for podcasters to say, leave a rating and a review in Apple Podcasts. And there is value in it, and that it's social proof. Like if you were to look at a new restaurant on Yelp, you'd probably look at the reviews and say, okay, is this any good? It'd be nice to see a couple 5-star reviews. And more importantly, it's an ego play. It's great for the ego of the podcaster to say, hey, people like me, Stuart Smalley. They actually really, really like me. But it doesn't matter. People are not going to find podcasts by looking at Apple charts. And I'm not sure if we have a slide on this maybe later, Matt, but the ways people discover podcasts: Google search, word of mouth, and social media. They're not finding your podcast based on Apple charts. So as a side piece here, if anybody emails you and says they can get you to the top of the Apple charts for X amount of dollars, it's a scam. They may be able to game the system for a minute and get you a hot minute on top of the charts, but it's not going to really do anything for your actual download numbers.
Which sort of dovetails into why I say never sell ads based on your ranking, because you could be 2 today and 92 tomorrow, and then your advertiser will call back and say, what's wrong with your show?
Yeah.
And the truth is nothing.
Matt, talk to me about PodTrack and this top publisher chart, because this lines up with the Inside Radio article earlier this week about iHeart's explosive growth in the podcast space.
Yeah, they've done a really good job about getting the word out there about how they've gotten to number one. Of course, they were saying they were number one long before they were really number one, but here they are. And they've done it by aggregating a lot of podcasts into number one. So they've done it with 632 shows.
They're the number one hit podcast station.
That's right.
But you look at NPR. I mean, I suppose an argument could be made for them getting 20 million just based on 49 podcasts. So where does it all fit in? I mean, these are really about being a publisher. Your 128 downloads are going to be fine with your audience. I think, again, if you compare yourself into this zone, it's going to be really hard. I mean, who are you as a podcaster? Where do you fit in? And what audience is going to make you happy? I mean, iHeart, I totally understand their strategy for having lots of podcasts, which means they've got a lot of inventory, by the way. So they're doing a great job, and I think they've really handled it well to get there. But that's not to mean that the podcasts at NPR are any different. They've got a lot of listeners on just 49 shows, so that's equally as impressive. So careful again when you hear we're number one.
I think iHeart is more about quantity because they have so many podcasts, where if you break those numbers down per active show, NPR has been in the game for much, much longer, and they have more quality, more downloads per show. I think that's really important to know too. And a lot of times iHeart, and not to pick on iHeart, but they'll say they have they're number one for podcasting. There's sometimes implying that their app is a relevant podcasting app. It's not in the grand scheme of things. We have a slide on that coming up, but it's Apple, Spotify, and Google. Those are the apps people are listening on the most.
Well, I think one of the questions that's coming from the audience, guys, is how can podcast creators best monetize their show? And I think that gets down to the question of, is it a scale question, or is it a P1 small groups of interested people question? So what do you guys think of that?
I think it depends. It really depends on what you're doing, on what kind of show you're doing. If you're niching down for an audience, then yeah, you can get some really dedicated people and focus on an advertiser that's that specific niche of an audience. If you are looking for a more broad appeal show, maybe with your radio station audience, I know, Matt, was it 1 year or 2 years that you say, Matt, before you can really start thinking about monetizing?
I usually advise people wait a year to see what kind of audience you have before you take your steps into that spot, because you don't know what you have, right? How can you, listen, Victor, you'll argue with me on this because of your background, but I'm like, how can you sell something when the actual number today is 0? You're actually selling to a group that doesn't even currently exist yet. And even a tougher piece of news is, how long does it take to build an audience? And the answer is about 3 years. And Valerie Geller says that many times. Dave Jackson has mentioned it many times. It takes 3 years to build yourself a podcast audience, the same way it takes 3 years for a radio station to get full traction into a market. I think it's just one of the media lessons that's out there. But after a year, you begin to see and have a good picture of your listeners. And, oftentimes if the show's just good enough, you will get some people asking, hey, let's do a partnership of sort. And it doesn't have to be advertising. It can be sometimes Patreon. It can be some partnerships. It could be affiliations. It can be a whole range of different things. It doesn't have to just necessarily be pre-rolls and mid-rolls.
Yeah. Well, and I think this goes back, Matt, to the in terms of sales, is like, I think an NPR or iHeart, like they're just in a different space because they're in the volume space. They're scale. So they're more about audio impressions, and I'm sure they do have some small focused pieces that they can bring out to potential advertisers as well. But it's a very different play than what Trader Joe's is doing with their strategy. So we got another question here I want to get to. Is it best to name your show clearly, or is a catchy name better?
Whatever is going to work for Google.
It's about the SEO.
Yeah. For instance, listen, don't do a podcast with funny spellings that eliminate vowels. People have to be able to find it. I'm very lucky to be working with one client who just named it the Insurance Podcast, and they happen to be there early. They've done such a great job that they are the Insurance Podcast. But if you're going into that space, have a look around to see what else is there and what's going to happen if you put it into Google. And find out what your competition is, and then get a good website, because that's really going to make a difference. Just one piece about the slide that everyone's looking at right now. This is my company, and what we're getting. We get a lot of Apple activity. That's fairly consistent with the rest of the industry, and Spotify sort of clocking in around 10%. And then you'll sort of notice you go down that the iHeartRadio gets just a fraction. So a lot of people might have the app. I, for instance, have the app. I love listening to it in the car. But I don't use it for podcasts, and I can't exactly explain why. But iHeart, when they say they're number one for podcasting, it's not necessarily the app. Again, it goes back to those downloads that we saw on the previous slide.
Well, and I think you made an interesting point earlier, and to the individual that asked about the catchy name, I think it dovetails into, like, you're going to need to market your podcast, and you're going to need a website. So you need to make sure your website is optimized to build traffic, so that when people search for it, you're going to show up there. Like, you want to get that organic search. You don't want to be lost in there.
Discoverability.
Yeah. So, talk to me about respecting your audience, Matt, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, because we do have another session starting in 10 minutes. So let's cover off this, Matt.
Yeah, go right back to Valerie Geller. Do not be boring. Do not have cliches. Respect their time. And so one of the questions a fun trivia question I ask people is, what is Netflix's biggest competition? And people will say, oh, it's the cable company, or it's this, or it's that. And it's like, no, the answer is sleep. They're actually, it's sleep. And when you boil it all down, when you're in podcast, you're actually competing against people's time and the stuff that they have to do and the BS that they have to go through. And, you're creating an island, a listening experience for them to listen to you. So make it worth their time.
And this is my slide, because I paid homage to the Queen of Soul here in Detroit, but respect your audience. And this goes back to what we talked about. Bad audio quality. When YouTube first came out, we'd watch anything on the internet, but oh wow, there's videos I can watch on the internet. Now, if the poor video quality on YouTube, you're going to click right through it. Same thing with podcasting. Unless the content is mind-blowingly out of this world, you are not going to listen to a podcast that has bad quality audio. Inconsistent volume is another one. We've all heard a podcast where the host is really loud and the co-host is like this. So you're in your car fiddling with the volume knob, depending on who's speaking, and it will drive you insane. So be respectful of your audience, their time and their ears. And other stuff. and this is where Matt and I spend a lot of time editing our clients' podcasts. We all use what are called disfluencies, and like, and and it's fine to leave some of them in there. Some of them are natural to the context of the conversation or as a transition piece. Let's talk about something else here. But a lot of them, I don't know if it's the same for you, Matt, but I would say I take out about 80% of these as a ballpark figure out of my client's podcast, just to make the show flow better. And it comes out to about 10% of the show. So if I have a client send me 60 minutes of audio, it's probably 54 when I'm done with it. And that's 6 minutes that you've given somebody back that's not sitting there listening to you, stumble your way through a thought like we all do sometimes.
We are saving minutes all the time.
So it sounds, guys. First of all, I want to thank you both for joining me today. And I knew having two on-air XPDs with a sales guy, the sales guy was never going to get a word in edgewise. So thank you for letting me kind of moderate slightly in this. But it really sounds like when you look at the key takeaways for me as I'm looking at some of the questions, it's like, this isn't just like, hey, I think I want to do a podcast. Like, you really need commitment. You need a storyline. You need to have a bunch in the can because it's going to take time to develop and sometimes years, to your point, Matt. You need to know who your audience is and be true to them. Then they need to find you. And then once you have all of that, then you can start to monetize everything. Does that encapsulate everything?
I think so. Yeah, that's success. It's a long game, and you got to play the long game with this. This is not for a few months or a few weeks.
Any parting thoughts for you, John, besides go Orange?
Go Bruins and go Patriots, because Matt's a Canadians and a Bills fan. I think no, but seriously, the long-term commitment really is there. One of the panelists at the podcast movement convention we were at earlier in the summer talked about how a lot of podcasts have fallen off in the last several months because sometimes people do it for about a year and they say, oh, well, either I have an issue with my co-host and it's not the marriage isn't working out, so to speak, or I haven't monetized it yet, or I don't have the bandwidth to do this. So a lot of folks who jumped on the bandwagon and started a podcast at the beginning of COVID when we were all locked down got to about a year and said, I don't really want to do this anymore. So if you can really make the commitment to it, there's a really good chance for you to succeed in the space because the competition is not as stiff as you would think, as Matt pointed out with those numbers earlier.
Awesome. Listen, gentlemen, thank you both very much. There is another question coming in about the video recording. This will be sent out, and we will have a copy on our website at socastdigital.com. So Matt, it's great to see you again. And John, it's over the last few weeks. It's been great to get to know you.
Likewise.
And thank you both for your time. For those attending, thank you for joining us, and have an awesome day. Stay safe, everyone.